I am Larry Martin, and I'm going to speak on the economic impact of Medicaid. My wife went to some event the other day, and I said, "How was it, dear?" And she says, "Oh, there was this aging professor, and he was having trouble with the PowerPoint." So anyway, so.
Do you want to speak from your seat?
That's all right.
Okay.
Yeah. So what I want to talk about is the causal effect of Medicaid. So my view is we know a lot about the causal effect of Medicaid. It was almost as if the program were designed to help us understand it. So it was introduced in '66, as everybody knows, so that's 50 years ago or so, but not in every state simultaneously. So through the first year, a little more than half of the states adopted the program, and then more every year. There were still 5 states by 1970 that hadn't adopted the program, and then got around to Alaska in '72, Arizona, not even until '82. I'm not exactly sure of that story. Then it was expanded a couple of times. '84 to '87, it was sort of decoupled from AFDC. And then you had the further expansions toward the end of the '80s, raising the income level that allowed eligibility. And then tremendous variation across the states. So Steve was talking about the considerations that the governor and the legislature were thinking about when they instituted Healthy Michigan, and of course they wanted to put Michigan's stamp on it, and they did, and so did Arkansas, and so did all the other states. Typically, as the program expanded, there was a period where states could voluntarily adopt some things, increase some income limits, change the asset test, things like that, and then later there would be a mandate that everybody do that. So throughout the whole period, you have variation across the states and over time. And that's what allows for learning. I mean, if you want to know the effect of fertilizer on the tastiness of your tomatoes, you want to plant a lot of pots with different amounts of fertilizer. And Medicaid effectively did that. So I'd like to say a word, since I used the word cause, why you should have confidence in the research on Medicaid. So first, variation allows learning. So suppose that an outcome were different before and after the adoption of Medicaid. So can you attribute the change in that outcome? Maybe work effort, maybe saving, maybe blood pressure, or whatever, some outcome that we're interested in. Can you attribute that to Medicaid? Well, of course you can't. That's no convincing argument, because lots of things happen. And some of the research that I find pretty exciting, I am an economist, but that I'll show you toward the end about the long-term impacts of Medicaid. Well, how could you identify that Medicaid was the cause of something that happened decades later? I mean, the standard of living, immigration, the Vietnam War, the Gulf War, all these things could have major impacts, and how do you disentangle Medicaid? So the way you do it is you compare the change in the outcome across states over time. And then all of these other things, well, they're going to affect Connecticut and Wisconsin and Arkansas similarly. And so this method is called difference in difference. So we take the difference that Medicaid make and compare that difference across states, and then the other things all drop out. So lots of these studies that I'm going to talk about do that sort of thing. And then Medicaid has, oh, and by the way, you wouldn't have that opportunity to learn about, say, Social Security, which is much more uniform across the states. And then Medicaid has a limit, and that allows us to make a different kind of comparison. So say the limit is 135% of the poverty line, then we can look at people who are just above that, who don't qualify, and people just below that. And this method is called regression discontinuity, and it's quite powerful. So you can pick something, say, like doctor visits that increase with income, and then watch doctor visits increase with income up to the limit and then beyond the limit. And there often is a discontinuity, a jump right at the limit, and that allows us to identify that it's Medicaid that's really making the difference. Then the laws are really complicated, of course. Steve was talking about how different it is in Michigan. So when we compare outcomes across states, then we say, well, is the difference in the outcome in Connecticut compared to Pennsylvania due to the difference in the law, or the fact that Connecticut people are different from Pennsylvania people? So the usual approach is to take a sample of the population and see what fraction of that would be eligible in the different states, the national population, and that eliminates any differences in state population. So that becomes an instrument that allows us to identify more carefully the effect of the Medicaid itself. And finally, we actually have a real experiment. So in Oregon, they expanded Medicaid, and they had money for 30,000 people and 90,000 applicants. So they did a lottery, and it was designed by Amy Finkelstein, a great economist, and so that's perfect. We take medicines that doctors tell us to take because they passed this kind of experiment. So those are the four main ways that economists these days address this problem of identification. Can we say it's Medicaid that caused it, or something else? So, what questions? Well, I picked four. So there are loads of questions. There's a mountain of research, and I picked four to look into. So one is, what extent does Medicaid replace private insurance? And that's an issue of crowding out. And then the second is work effort. So since there are coverage limits on Medicaid, you think people might limit their earnings to stay right below the limit. So there might be bunching at that limit. Then how is the consumption of health care affected? And then how is health itself? And then, like I say, some pretty cool stuff about the long-run impact. So just to give you an idea, recent research has looked at the effect of the Medicaid expansion, which is under the ACA Act, which is, again, just designed to help us understand it because some states adopted it and some states didn't. Now, you might think that's cruel social policy, but for research, it's good. And so you can see among people with parents versus childless adults, those are the percentages of people who gained insurance coverage. The uninsured declined by something like 8 to something like 10% among the two populations. And then there's a little bit of crowding out, but not much, something like 0 to 5%. Then other papers looking at the whole bill itself find little, if any, crowding out. Earlier, they found more crowding out from Medicaid, but that was a different world. While our standard of living is way better than it was in the late 60s and early 70s, the 5 blade razors and all those kinds of things that make our life better, it's relatively, the people who were near being eligible for Medicaid were much better off in the late 60s and early 70s. We've had an explosion of inequality since then. So back then they had relatively more private insurance, and so there was some crowding out, but evidently not much recently. So what about work effort? It's kind of controversial because mainly because of this study. So I'll say it. Tennessee expanded its Medicaid in the 90s, and they basically switched it to managed care and used the savings to cover more people. And then in 2005, they reversed that. And when they did reverse it, the people who were thrown off Medicaid showed a substantial increase in work effort and in the buying of private insurance. So there's some thought that might happen here. There are some things special about this population in Tennessee in that they had done this recertification process, and what they were left with was people who were willing to go through this and probably had very high demands for health insurance. But you should be aware of that. Then the Great Oregon Experiment, you have people who won the lottery and got Medicaid and people who didn't win the lottery and didn't get Medicaid, and then what does their work effort look like? And not much difference at all. So not statistically significant, maybe 3% higher probability of finding a job. Maybe they make 195 in a year, so it's not a big deal. And I think that the population in Oregon being more randomly selected was poorer and maybe less of high demanders for medical insurance. Then people have looked at Medicaid expansions, and again, you do this difference in difference approach. So we get Medicaid expansions in some states, not in others, and we track the work effort of people, and most of that finds little effect. So I was kind of surprised to find that out. So about healthcare and health, well, there's been lots of research. They're a different thing. That's really underscored by a famous experiment they ran at Rand in the 70s, where people were given different policies with different copays, and people who were given the policies with higher copays used less insurance, and people with lower copays used more medical care, but their health outcomes were the same. So we do find more use of, there's been a lot of studies that I think are the most important ones about prenatal care and things like that, and we do find more use of things like fetal monitoring and things like that. And then some of these longer run studies have found some reduction in child mortality and low birth rate. The Oregon experiment, this was going to be the greatest thing because they had data on blood pressure and sugar in the blood and various kinds of health outcomes, and found basically that people used more medical care, they felt better about it, they took more preventive care, but very little effect on health itself. There's some reduced incidence of depression and increased diagnosis of diabetes. Both of those things are probably a good thing, since there was no time for a causal effect on diabetes. It's probably just increased diagnosis. So the last thing I want to say something about is the long run effects. So again, we have this difference in difference approach about the introduction of Medicaid. So it happened in some states and not in others. Period passed. In some states, children had more years on Medicaid, and in some states, fewer years. And, tracing this out for people as adults, so 25 to 54, this study I'm talking about, and I can give you the references are in the notes to this, but they found they constructed a chronic condition index. So those are the things that trouble the developed countries these days: high blood pressure, heart disease, obesity, type 2 diabetes, and they found significant reduction in that index for the adults who spent more time on Medicaid and reduced adult disability. That's what that's supposed to say. And then the last thing is just, since I have 2 minutes, is people are worried about the budget. So let's take our view away from the recipients of Medicaid and say, okay, whatever happened, let's just look at the dollars coming into the government and the dollars going out. So this is what they call dynamic scoring, right? When you cut taxes, then when you raise taxes, say on gasoline, people consume less gasoline, so you don't take in as much money as you thought you did, and then vice versa if you cut taxes. But the same thing is true on expenditure programs. And so what's the long-run effect of being on Medicaid? Well, if you trace people who were, we make comparisons of people who gained Medicaid eligibility when they were children, and we do that by linking the parents' tax records and the child's tax records. And anyway, they earn about $300 more a year in adulthood, and they have reduced draws on transfer programs, maybe of $600. So suppose you just look at this as an investment. So we spend money on Medicaid, and then we get this money back. Well, it yields about a 7% rate of return. So just looking at the dollars and cents coming into the government, I think that's quite a stunning fact. And, people say, well, we can't afford this. Well, that's like saying you can't afford to build a good road bed, right? If you don't build a good road bed, then it costs you more over time, and Medicaid is something like that. So that's what I have to say about the economic issues, and I would be happy to answer questions later.